The tight end position continues to get the job done for us in 2025. In the last several years, it feels like the position is an absolute wasteland, but this year has been one of the best years for tight ends in quite some time. Through 8 weeks last season, there were only 2 tight ends that had scored more than 80 points on the season. There were 8 total tight ends that had more than 60 fantasy points for the season. This year through week 8, there are 6 tight ends with more than 80 fantasy points so far, and 11 tight ends that have scored more than 60. Tight end scoring is way up across the board, and hopefully in week 9 they get the job done for you once again. But maybe it doesn't happen on Thursday Night Football. Mark Andrews has one game inside the top 20 tight ends this season. Very similar to last year where he just didn't get the job done. However, this matchup against Miami, who allows the 10th most fantasy points per game, would be an opportunity for him to offer you some fantasy points. And if Lamar Jackson can return this week, which it sounds like he will, that helps Mark Andrews out quite a bit. For me, Mark Andrews is really only a guy I'll start if for some reason you don't have any other options and you're willing to risk it for some upside. And for Miami, I'm not even putting the names of the other tight ends on the board. Maybe they'll go off on Thursday Night Football. I don't know. But if their name is Darren Waller, they literally have not been utilized all season long in this Dolphins offense. Chicago and Cincinnati will have a couple of interesting options. What about Colston Loveland if Cole Kmet can't go again? Going up against Cincinnati, that allows the most fantasy points per game. Maybe this is where Loveland gets going for once. It's kind of an emergency option because last week he had 5 targets and he caught 3 of them for 38 yards. But Olamide Zaccheaus, he had more targets than what Loveland did last week. And with the inconsistencies of Caleb Williams so far, I don't know if I want to trust it on Loveland. But if you don't have any other options, he would be a high upside, high risk play. Noah Fant, not nearly as risky. This is one of those guys I think could sneak just inside the top 12. And I like his potential a lot better than some of these other risky fringe starts. For Noah Fant, it's a great matchup. Chicago allows the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and he has 85 receiving yards over the last 2 games, but only 7 total targets. So while the volume isn't a whole lot, he's doing quite a bit with the volume he is getting. Minnesota and Detroit. TJ Hawkinson, you know that he loves to get a shot at his former team. But for me personally, when I look at TJ Hawkinson, I haven't seen anything respectable in terms of fantasy points yet this season. And I know he had a touchdown called back a couple of weeks ago, and that could have given him a really solid day. But it doesn't matter because even if you factor in that one play, he's been bad a majority of the year. JJ McCarthy is expected back, but the thing is JJ wasn't looking towards Hawkinson even when Jordan Addison wasn't on the field at the beginning of the year. So you've got Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and potentially even Aaron Jones ahead of TJ Hawkinson in targets right now. Prior to week 7, Sam Laporta had seen at least 4 targets in every game this season. Unfortunately, it's a lot of up and down with him, and that's what happens with the Detroit Lions offense. If you're not Jahmyr Gibbs and you're not Amon-Ra St. Brown, you always have the opportunity for some solid games, but then you also have the opportunity to maybe just not see enough production in any given week. Going up against Minnesota, Sam Laporta for me will be a fringe start because the floor isn't that great, but he'll have a decent ceiling as always. Ja'Tavion Sanders and Tommy Tremble are going to be very interesting this week, going up against Green Bay, who allowed the 3rd most fantasy points per game. Last week, Ja'Tavion Sanders saw 54% of the snaps. Tommy Tremble saw 46% of the snaps. Now, we really should play somebody here, and here is why. Over the last few games this season for the Green Bay Packers, they've allowed 74 receiving yards on 10 catches and 2 touchdowns to Trey McBride, 8 receptions and 37 yards with a touchdown to the Cincinnati tight ends, 40 yards and 7 receptions with a touchdown to Jake Ferguson, 65 yards on 8 receptions to the Cleveland tight ends, 64 yards on 6 receptions with a touchdown to Zach Ertz, and 79 yards on 6 receptions to Sam Laporta. Ja'Tavion Sanders is playing the most snaps. That's why I'll say he is a fringe start right now, even though this is a very, very good matchup without a whole lot of indicators to who would be the guy. Tucker Kraft is coming off a dominant performance and now gets a defense allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game. Tucker Kraft is good to go this week. For the Chargers and the Titans, Oronde Gadsden is making some huge waves right now. It's a tougher matchup. Tennessee is allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But over the last 2 games, Gadsden has caught 12 of his 14 targets for 241 yards and 2 touchdowns. Over the last 3 weeks, he has seen 25 targets. He is being thrown the ball quite a bit right now. Unfortunately, he disappeared in the second half last week, and he's still going to have to compete with the fact that he has 3 wide receivers on his team that can see quite a bit of targets as well. The thing that concerns me the most about this matchup is that if LA gets out to a solid lead, Kamani Vidal will take care of things in the run game. In 3 of his last 4 games, Chigioco has seen at least 5 targets and 45 receiving yards. But that one game that he didn't hit that mark, he had 2 targets, no receptions, and no yards against New England. Tougher matchup against the Chargers, allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Chigioco, for me this week, is probably going to be somebody that I would avoid. I just don't see the upside. New England's defense has been really solid this season, but the one area that they've struggled in is against tight ends, allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game. Kyle Pitts, great matchup, 19 total targets over the last couple of weeks. Even with Kirk Cousins under center last week, still saw the ball. He was the leading receiver for this team. And this week in this matchup, whether it's Michael Penix back or Kirk Cousins has to go again, Kyle Pitts, I feel like, has a very solid floor. Some of that will depend on whether or not Drake London can end up going. If he can, the floor is not as bad as you would probably think. It's the ceiling, I think, that takes a bigger hit. Atlanta is allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Hunter Henry has been short of good for quite a while. He hasn't been a top 12 tight end since week 4, and yes, he had a touchdown last week, but it was his only target. He's not being looked at enough. George Kittle scoring a touchdown on National Tight End Day? Absolutely. You have to imagine that is a part of the San Francisco game plan every single season. The one thing I would like to see, though, is a little bit more volume, and we'll see what happens with George Kittle moving forward. We know he's got big playability. We know he's got touchdown potential. The volume might be a little bit up and down, especially considering the fact that Brock Purdy could be going this week, but it still is favoring Mac Jones. I don't really know exactly who's going to start at the quarterback position. It sounds like Brock Purdy is going to be close, but is still a long shot to play. And if that's the case, Mac Jones, I like Kittle's ceiling a little bit less with him than I do with Purdy. Daniel Bellinger has been playing well. Theo Johnson has kind of disappeared as of recent. Both of these guys are seeing a decent amount of playing time, although Daniel Bellinger is banged up right now. It's a tough matchup against San Francisco, allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game. So this week, I think there's better options to risk it with than these guys. Tyler Warren should be looked at as a top 5 option at the tight end position this week. Getting a matchup against Pittsburgh, allowing the 2nd most fantasy points per game, Tyler Warren has an opportunity for an absolutely huge day. Now, last week he did not score a touchdown, and that snapped a streak of 4 straight games that he had scored. This week, however, I definitely see that he could get back into the end zone, but not just a touchdown, a lot of volume to go with it. Indianapolis is allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But who are you supposed to play from the Pittsburgh tight ends? There is literally nothing that is going to predict success among these tight ends. They all had good fantasy days a couple of weeks ago against Cincinnati, but it's been an up and down type of roller coaster, not just in terms of fantasy points, but in terms of who's on the field more often. Because there was a stretch there where Darnell Washington had eclipsed 80% of the snaps. And then all of a sudden, the last couple of weeks, that fell back off. And then last week, all of a sudden, he was back up over 60% and was on the field more than Pat Freiermuth. The only tight end that's seeing anything consistent right now is Jonnu Smith, who continues to lead the team in snaps and is consistently over 60%, while Freiermuth and Washington switch back and forth. And part of me wonders if that has to do with the game plan. If they run the football a little bit more or plan to try and do that, or if they need more help blocking, Washington's going to be on the field more than Freiermuth. If they don't feel like they're going to need that extra blocking, then Freiermuth plays a little bit more. But again, there's nothing to really back that up. Evan Ingram against Houston is not the best matchup in the world. Houston's defense has been solid really in every aspect of the game, and they allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the opposing tight end position. Marvin Mims has the potential to be banged up still this week and may not be on the field. Cortland Sutton and Troy Franklin, they're going to have a tough matchup. Evan Ingram, to me, doesn't have a ceiling any higher than maybe 5 to 7 points, 10. He's lucky if he scores, but that's really the cap for me this week. So because of that, I do think he's still a fringe start, but he's a risky one. I am not going back to Dalton Schultz. We got killed on that one last week, and everything seemed absolutely set up for Dalton Schultz to see a decent amount of targets. Even going into that game last week, he had been getting a consistent amount of targets, and then he disappeared. Going up against Denver, allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game. No Patrick Surtain this week, so they have an easier matchup on the outside than they did before. Dalton Schultz, for me, I'm not getting sucked into that mess again. Jacksonville and Las Vegas, and since Brenton Strange has gone down, no tight end has really done anything for Jacksonville as of yet, and it's a tough matchup. Las Vegas allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends right now. And coming out of the bye, we really hope we get Brock Bowers back this week, but if we don't, we might have to look somewhere else. I'll list him as questionable for the time being. If he plays, though, you clearly play Brock Bowers, right? Juwan Johnson has worked his way back to being a fringe start this season. I mean, he had a good start to the season, kind of disappeared, and it seems like he might be coming back now. He was the tight end 10 and the tight end 12 the last couple of weeks, and he has 15 targets combined in those 2 games. Taysom Hill has not been nearly as an issue for Juwan Johnson as a lot of people thought. He only saw 3 touches last week, and he's not being utilized like he was in the past. Part of that may be because he's just not the same guy. He's coming off the injury. He doesn't have the explosiveness that he once had. Maybe that happens the rest of the season. Maybe he gets a little bit more healthy and they do utilize him a little bit more. Juwan Johnson, though, let's keep seeing the targets. If we can average 7.5 targets a game, we're solid. Tyler Higbee was the tight end 7 a couple of weeks ago, but honestly, outside of that, he has one top 19 performance, and everything else is 30 or lower. We haven't seen enough consistency with him. He's a sit. Travis Kelce is coming off of a huge game, and a lot of people are going to feel really, really good about that. Then they're going to see the fringe start here, and they're going to be a little bit more worried. Buffalo is a tougher defense against tight ends, allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game, and I am hesitant to just throw Travis Kelce back out there as a must start. I know he's coming off of a really good game, but a couple of weeks ago when Rashee Rice returned, he was only the tight end 20. So not necessarily every single game is going to be as big as we just saw. While I will say that Travis Kelce still has a solid floor every single week, that type of ceiling is going to be way more inconsistent, which to me makes him more of a fringe start than a must start. I mean, Dalton Kincaid did terribly for us last week, and he's been one of the better tight ends all season. This week going up against Kansas City, it's a tougher matchup. Kansas City allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game. But the good news about matchups like this is that they tend to get a little bit wild. They tend to throw the ball an awful lot, and there tends to be a decent amount of offense. If there is for Buffalo, I got to imagine that Dalton Kincaid is in that mix and is touchdown likely once again. For Seattle and Washington, AJ Barner makes his way into the fringe conversation based on touchdown potential alone in the red zone. We know volume-wise, JSN is getting everything. I think Torrey Horton could be in for maybe a bigger play this week. AJ Barner could end up being the number 3 option. But by the time you get JSN all of his targets, there's not really a whole lot left over, even if you are the number 3 option. Seattle is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so Zach Ertz feels like he's got to be a start this week. But I can't list him as a start until I see if Jaden Daniels is playing. Jaden Daniels and Zach Ertz have a great connection, but now with Debo back, now with Terry McLaurin back, who apparently his quad is acting up a little bit again, so we'll see what happens next week. If there's no Terry McLaurin and there's Jaden Daniels, Zach Ertz is definitely a start for me. If Terry McLaurin does end up playing, I probably leave Zach Ertz right here at fringe with Jaden Daniels. And if there is Terry McLaurin, but it's Marcus Mariota again, I might be looking for different options. Jake Ferguson and Trey McBride have been 2 of the best tight ends this entire season. So this feels like the perfect matchup to remind everybody that our friends over at Tushy are the only people in the world that love tight ends as much as your boy, the Tight End Whisperer. And if you want to get 15% off of your order over at Tushy, you better hurry because our code Headliners is going to be expiring soon. And you trust me to help you with your fantasy tight ends every single week. So you're hearing it from me first. If you're looking for someone to take care of your actual tight end, Tushy, they're the people to do it. And we're starting Jake Ferguson and Trey McBride both this week. Right before their bye week, Trey McBride had 3 touchdowns in 2 games. Kyler Murray, I would expect him to be back this week, so hopefully this guy will look for him in the red zone as much as Jacoby Brissett had been doing. And Jake Ferguson was terrible last week, and he let fantasy owners down tremendously. This week, though, Arizona is allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so I would hope and expect that Jake Ferguson would be solid again. Headliner Nation, how is your tight end position looking? Have you had somebody that you could roll with all season long, or have you been playing the matchups and streaming your tight ends? Let me know down in the comments below. But we're on to wide receivers and quarterbacks after this, so hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here, bell notifications, comments below, all of the good stuff. But stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.